So a lot of this work was also just to acknowledge the EAT Lancet report that really put out a real perspective that's driving a lot of conversation around what's a planetary healthy diet, and what does that mean in terms of not only a local perspective that acknowledges resources, but also tradition, culture, food preference, and how do we think about that on a scale that is including a global kind of conversation around how do we do this across different communities. So we're mirroring that. So that's where, for us, good food purchasing comes in. So it's really guiding a social policy. It's social policy-driven procurement. And that's going to be a little bit different than the way that historically we have procured food from a city government perspective, and I'm going to talk about that. Okay. So is everyone, or folks familiar with the good food purchasing framework? Yeah, I'm seeing some nodding. Good. Okay. So great. So it started, from good work that happened in LA. There's been a lot of communities across, or cities across the U.S. that have increasingly adopted this model as a way of framing their thinking around how are they driving their decisions for procurement. And one of the things to acknowledge that in New York, we have, gold stars, I would say, in terms of where we are on the health and nutrition dimensions for how the city has and continues to procure food, meaning that we're above federal standards, that we do a lot of work to make sure that we have across agencies that are serving very different populations, from child care centers. Oh, wow, 5 minutes already. Okay, sorry. I'm going to talk really fast. That we look at different populations and think about food in different ways, but we're meeting their health needs very centrally. Our opportunity here is increasingly to take on the full balance of the framework, and there's a lot of work moving in that direction. And this is where we're bringing together those environmental and those broader social and economic dimensions of social policy into the ways that we're thinking about buying food for people that we're serving. All right, I'm going to go really quickly to 2 points that I want to make. So if we think about what's happening in New York and how we're really leveraging this work here, I will say it's important to note that there's a lot of energy and work happening. We're at a starting place. This is a big sea change in the way that we're thinking about procuring food, and that all of the underlying structures have to fit into those choices. So it's one thing to say we value these things, these are important. It's a different thing to say we have all of our different rules and regulations about how we need to purchase food and provide that aligned with those goalposts. So that is work that's underway right now across a range of different agencies in the city. Importantly, and I'm just going to give a shout out, we have a colleague from DOE here, and they are doing incredible work on this front, and actually moving way out ahead of even what is required, but really stepping in and stepping up to really think about how we're doing this for the largest community in New York that we are serving on a daily basis in public schools. So one of the things to note is that this is really important because it's an opportunity to bring these dimensions of how do we make sure that vulnerable populations have access to healthy food, and then we're also supporting the environment. So that's the key piece around vulnerable populations. The second piece is around dollars. New York annually, as a city government, we are the second largest food purchaser in the country behind the U.S. or the U.S. military. So we spend over $300 million a year on food for different populations that we're serving in New York. That's a lot of signaling to the market and to the ways that we're serving communities in New York to do justice to that. The element of innovation is important because this is an opportunity for New York to really think about how do we do this work well here, now, and that supports a long-term solution, and how do we actually help other communities think about how they can take on these principles and models as well. Really important as a role for us. Policy. There is a lot of energy, as we heard, around food equity, climate, and the conversations that are happening not only in the administration, in city council, in communities, and different rooms where we're thinking about these issues. And it's important for us to continue to really be thoughtful about what are the big, bold ideas that we can put forward from a policy perspective that are going to support this work across very different ways that agencies are working. And then finally, partnership. I think this is a key piece that we need to continue to build around how are we leveraging all of our city resources to deliver on good food purchasing, from recycling to procurement to nutrition education, that this is an opportunity for all those agencies who are very interested to move this work collectively to be able to have that perspective. I also think it's important here to talk about partnership with community. We know that there's an incredible amount of work and leadership across many communities in New York, and this is a way for communities to really see themselves as a part of that process solution, not just in conversation, but helping to evidence that in the ways that they're able to help co-create solutions. So really important as a flag there. Okay, and I'm going to move really quickly. I'm sure we can share slides with folks, and if you have questions. One thing I want to just move to quickly is around some of the challenges and opportunities. So I'm going to flag that one of the key kind of pieces that I mentioned is around integrating social policy into procurement. Historically, a lot of these choices are based on cost. And so if we are really driving from bigger principles that are helping to serve people better, serve the environment better, that's equally going to have a bearing on how we think about cost. Now, there's an immediate cost of buying an item, but there's also the long-term return on that investment. And I think we need to get better at thinking about how we factoring that into the choices that we're making in procurement and demonstrating why we're choosing certain items or bids or partners to work with in that process. A second piece is really signaling readiness to the market, that New York is a place where volume is a key piece of how we think about procuring food. With the number of people that we serve, we need to make sure that producers, growers, and those that are really working towards these principles are really ready to be able to provide those resources to the city, right? So you need to have a demand, and then you need to have a supply for that. And that's one piece that we continue to work on to be able to move that work forward. Creating momentum beyond public agencies. This is something I'm excited to talk about. I think this is kind of a 2.0 idea, but how does New York become an environment of good food purchasing? Whereas the city agencies are signaling, but how is this also about businesses? How is this also about restaurants? How is it also about communities where they are good food purchasing retailers and environments where people are taking on this mantle because we have stepped into the process as a public sector to evidence that we can do this, but we're creating the space and the opportunity for others to join in that process. So I think that's a really interesting conversation and opportunity. Two last points. Deepening decisions through data. So data is central to the opportunity to move. It's a lot of the information that we need to be able to move in this direction continues to need to be added to the ways that we know about the food that we're purchasing, right? So these are not, we don't have all of the different signals per item on those different perspectives of labor, on environment, and we need to think more about how we incorporating that data into the decisions that we're making so that we actually are able to evidence the changes that we're making and know how that food is working in accordance to those different values. Finally, really creating space for dialogue. This is an exciting conversation. There's a lot of opportunity to really build tables where we're continuing to have this conversation with community, with different stakeholders that are invested from an advocacy perspective, with different thought leaders that are helping us think about how we move this work ahead. So that's another space that is a real opportunity in this work to think about how food becomes an element to really drive conversation. And we see it as a place of sustenance, but as a place of really convening and breaking bread to move bigger ideas. So I'm going to close with that. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. My name is Jen Tarot. I'm the Chief Service Officer at Green City Force. Really excited to be here. Green City Force is a national service and training organization that engages young adults 18 to 24 who resides in NYCHA to serve a term of 4 to 10 months in response to sustainability priorities of New York City and sustainability priorities in NYCHA. We have a core response. It's we are the movement, we are the force. Actually, let's try that now. This is what we do with 52 members who are present, who are actively serving all across the city. When I say we are the movement, we all say you are the force. We are the force. You guys ready? We are a movement. We are the force. Okay, awesome. And so we're training the leaders to power green economy through service. And that's what's been our mission for the last 1.5 years. Our Green New Deal, GCF, means the intersections between youth unemployment, sustainability goals, and national service. Okay. We focus on NYCHA because of the potential, the high potential. It's 500,000 New Yorkers who depend on NYCHA housing, and so it's really critical for us to, in order for us to move the sustaining priorities and really chip away at the promise of the Green New Deal, we really need to prioritize NYCHA because it's as large as Philly and close to Boston, to the population of Boston. So like I mentioned, Green City Force's big idea is to connect the dots between youth unemployment and the priorities in New York City and NYCHA sustainability. So just really quickly on what the core member journey is like, we are very, we're in public housing, deep in public housing development. Most of our staff and we completely just focus 100% at NYCHA recruiting. And so it starts with a recruitment and orientation of a minimum of 52 core members. And then we do an intensive service and training for 4 to 10 and a half months, mostly primarily focused on long-term service. And they train intensively in urban agriculture and energy efficiency, in solar, and environmental literacy. We also have a body, over a 500 alumni body who are powering the green, equitable cities. So what we see now is our alumni bodies across New York City who are the leaders of a lot of our sustainability green jobs as we see. We also have an alumni here from Green City Forest. Miguel, please, yeah! Give it up for Miguel, who came out, asked his employer to be present for today. So like I mentioned, we have over 500 alumni network, and just an example of the career and training the career pathways that our members go into, and it's ag, core, landscape. Our members are in the union. They are in Franklin Energy and a lot of intensive energy efficiency jobs that we're seeing, and in Brooklyn Botanical Gardens as like organics recovery coordinators, health coordinators, public health work. Our flagship service initiatives is the Farms at NYCHA and the Love Where You Live. The Love Where You Live is a behavior change method that's used for outreach in NYCHA development. So we have access to 6 NYCHA developments across the city, and our members are deployed to serve and use what we call the Love Where You Live method or approach to support the sustainability behavior change that's needed for us to really chip away again at achieving sustainability wins at NYCHA. And our Farms at NYCHA is 6 NYCHA large-scale farms at NYCHA, and so we started at Red Hook 6 years ago, and we replicated our core has built for the last 3.5 years large-scale farms at NYCHA, and they model and replicate the programming that we started in Red Hook Houses Farm. So these are all our sites: Red Hook, Bayview Houses, Mariners Harbor. So Mariners Harbor is in Staten Island, Forest is in the Bronx, Wagner in Harlem, and Howard Houses in Brooklyn. We we're reaching thousands of residents annually. We do, at the farms, we have an exchange-based policy. So our core members have built the farms, but they grow the food at the start of the season. And in exchange for the produce, our residents are expected to provide us with compost, so food scraps from their homes twice a week. And we provide them with the produce that's grown for the week. Or they could also do some volunteering, so a minimum of 30 minutes or however long. And we have had, for the last 3.5 years, it's been over 92,000 pounds of produce that has been distributed to the NYCHA residents across the city at these NYCHA locations. And we have over 18,000 visits at the farm stand. So residents are coming out, they're volunteering, they're collecting, they're bringing in their compost. And we've achieved over 16,000 pounds of compost collected from residents, and have educated, our core has educated over 3,000 students. Our Love You Live method approach for behavior change and sustainability education is starting by having our core be the relevant messengers. So our core is, they're from NYCHA, and they're trained at the beginning at orientation and for the rest of their service term on how to really effectively achieve sustainability education by door knocking and getting the resident connected to these principles of sustainability, food scrap collection, thinking about waste. And they also, service projects have included things as far as the Cool Roofs project to energy efficiency, like swapping light bulbs at NYCHA to what are intensive pilots on recycling and compost reduction. So the way we achieve this in our Love Relive method and our Farms at NYCHA is a multifaceted approach in partnership. So we're in partnership with community because we're on the ground. We have private partners, we have NYCHA, and we have public partners. So it's New York City Housing Authority, we have the Mayor's Office of Chief Technology Officer, we have GROW NYC, we have the Department of Sanitation and DEP. We, over the course of 4 years, we've had over 40,000 NYCHA residents reach conservation education because of the work that we've been doing with our core, educating with the Love Relive method, and having the hubs that are what we call Farms at NYCHA to be an example of what it means to do this work and have access to the community while also having strategic partnerships. And these are our numbers. So again, public-private partnerships work. We are known for our scale to core, but really our strategic ways of working with other partners. And what we're imagining what's next after Green City. So after Farms at NYCHA is what we would eventually coin as eco-resiliency hubs powered by Green City Forest. So we know that the food conversations will still continue to happen, and it's a real important topic at NYCHA with our communities. But we also want to make sure that we're an example of a sustainable system at the farms. So we'll have resilient closed-loop systems to benefit the NYCHA residents, but also make sure that there isn't water dependency, that the energy usage that we use at the farms is efficient. And we are really just at the phase, and have been for a long time, of innovation. So the Eco-Resiliency Hubs is an example of more innovation that's using our core, leveraging our core to have massive reach to the community, and also our public and private partnerships to execute all of the many goals that we have. So we imagine the eco-resiliency hubs continues with the youth development and workforce training, community engagement and cohesion, access to healthy foods, and landscape transformation and complete ecosystem services. We've actually partnered for the last 3.5 years with Dr. Nevin Cohen at the school to do a 3-year evaluation, and we'll be having an event on next week on Thursday, October 3rd at NYCHA offices to talk about the 3-year evaluation that Dr. Nevin Cohen and the rest of his team has conducted on the work that we've been doing, leading us to this next phase. That because of the research, we found that there's a lot of amazing savings that come out of the work that we're doing for the city, and so we're just on to really pursuing this next goal and venture at our site. We will continue to grow in developing Farms at NYCHA with the support of our NYCHA partners. So we've been combing through for the last couple of years, and 3.5 years in particular, the 6 of the major city goals that we are making sure that our core is supporting, and we're creating service plans to support these citywide goals. And so this is just one example of like a Wagner site. It's Wagner House site. Who has been to NYCHA houses, Wagner houses? Okay, Wagner, that's great. So this is just an idea, a design concept that we worked with Berkeley researchers to think about how can we create resiliency hubs, how can we think about our core being leveraged national service and the training to create the pipeline of green leaders for our green jobs. And so this is graduation, what it looks like to have a growing growing group of young adults who are leading in the green economy. This is where I leave it. What if there was a way to enlist a whole generation and period of full-time service to support the transition to new and just economy? So that is our position, and I thank you for your time.
Good morning. It is great to be here. It's great to see so many people here this morning. I want to thank Rositza and Nick and Nevin for making this connection between the Green New Deal and food and farms and what it means to us. I think for all the reasons Nick articulated, that sort of extra kick and putting these issues front and center, this is the time to do it. What I'm going to be talking about is sort of completely different from what everyone else has been talking about so far, but also integrally related. Nick talked about, and Aaron mentioned how, each of the speakers are offering different perspectives on this issue, but I think what's really critical, this is not the right slide. Who's in charge of the slides? I am. There we go. What's really critical is that we think about them as being complementary and all necessary at the same time. They have to be effective and functioning well. So the piece I want to talk about in a sustainable regional food system, and I think that whole concept, a sustainable regional food system, you talk to probably pick 6 people in this audience and you'll get 6 different answers to what that means. I think of it as something that's sort of aspirational, but we all have a general idea of what's included in it, and some of the things that have been spoken about before around procurement and around distribution are critical and have to be in place. But at the very foundation of having a sustainable regional food system to serve New York City and its population is we have to have farms. We have to have farmland. And I would say not even 9 times out of 10, but 10 times out of 10, if you engage a group of people talking about food policy and what it takes to have a sustainable regional food system, the question of a secure agricultural land base just doesn't come up in the conversation. When I first started engaging in discussions around this issue in New York City with policy advocates and others several years ago, I felt a little bit like the organ in an organ donor transplant. The host body is either going to accept you or reject you. And all of the people I was talking to were rightly focused on their issues of the day here in New York City around food access, about public health, about school food, about getting food from Hunts Point into people's hands, etc. But this, guy from the Hudson Valley who's working with farmers to conserve their farms that happen to be the suppliers of those food, that really, again, that wasn't on the table. So a lot of times people say, don't worry about it. We have this burgeoning demand for fresh local food in New York City. So the farms will be assured that people are going to want their products. Aaron was saying, it's that supply chain that's so critical. We have the demand, where's the supply? But real estate dynamics, believe me, and other pressures, competition from overseas, etc., dairy pricing, etc., will always outcompete farming when it comes to being a land use that can be economically viable. So for New York City to continue to have access to fresh local food, like I said, we need distribution facilities like the new hub at Hunts Point that's being developed by the city and Grow NYC. We need the strong procurement policies that we were talking about before, but we also need to make sure that the agricultural land base is there so that we know that when we go to a green market, as just one example, there's actually going to be someone in the stall to sell you the food. In addition to providing the food, when we conserve the land base in the surrounding region, that has many other co-benefits. So building climate resiliency, supporting ecological health, and creating more affordable land access for new farmers all come along with that. Many are familiar with the saying, I think the American Farmland Trust coined it, no farms, no food. And see a lot of bumper stickers upstate with that on it. But we take this one step back and say, no farmland, no farms. And that's where we want people to begin thinking. The greatest number of regional farms serving New York City, the greatest concentration of them, are located in the Hudson Valley. A lot of people ask, or sort of say flippantly, well, there's no way this regional food is going to be able to feed New York City. You know, a few apple farms in Dutchess County is just not going to do it. And, you know, that's probably true. But there actually was a University of California study a few years ago that said if all of the agricultural land within 100 miles of the city was used optimally, it could provide up to 30% of the food New York City eats. And at the same time, it's maybe not necessary to achieve nirvana in this, but to make sure that we can sustain and increasingly improve and increase the amount of fresh local food that's available and make sure it's available for all. So we know New York City has tremendous unmet demand. We know that these farms are out there. The question is, how do we actually do it? Hold on, and I'll tell you. Okay, so first we have to think like a region. And I think in New York City there's an understanding on some level that the city sits at the heart, at the core, as the anchor of a region, and it includes not just the Hudson Valley, but portions of New Jersey, portions of Connecticut, Long Island. But have we really created a strategy to take that concept and put it into action to advance our food policy goals? It's exciting that in 2015, Mayor de Blasio created an Office of Regional Planning that didn't exist before. And those issues are beginning to be joined. Scenic Hudson started thinking about this idea of the Hudson Valley being the city's regional food shed and did a study, which is this, which is the first of its kind food shed conservation plan, a strategy for how a major metropolitan area conserves the farms that must be in place to make sure it continues to have a secure supply of fresh local food. More than 5,000 farms, and we prioritized each and every one of them against one another based on farm size, soil productivity, and the geographical relationship of one farm to another. These aren't mega farms. A lot of people think about agriculture as being, you know, very monolithic. All farms are the same. These are typically about 135 acres in size, family-owned, family-run farms that are providing the food that you get when you go to green markets and other outlets in the city, supporting the food's restaurant economy, and increasingly going to schools and other institutions. So we've been working with other land trusts for more than 20 years to conserve these farms. And I'm getting all messed up on that. And the question is sort of, how does that actually work in practice? What does it mean to conserve a farm? What we actually do is we purchase the development rights from the farmer. So there's an exchange going on. In return for a cash payment, the farmer agrees in perpetuity that their farm can never be subdivided and developed and used for other purposes. And they take that money and they invest it in farm viability and new infrastructure and in upgrading their farm activities. In the 20 years we've been doing this, conserving more than 140 local farms, more than 90% of those are still active and in production. Thank you. And why now and why in the Hudson Valley? As I said, the greatest concentration and number of farms serving New York City is in the Hudson Valley. The cost to do so is incredibly reasonable, between $5,000 and $7,500 an acre, as opposed to, and I'm not competitive, try to buy development rights on Long Island, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars an acre. But the resources don't exist to secure a critical mass in a reasonable period of time of the farms that the city needs to be in place. keep doing that. So the opportunity exists for the city as the largest single stakeholder in the regional food shed to invest and to leverage existing state, federal, and in some cases local programs that are already in place that are conserving farms. But what they're doing is not enough. A lot of people liken this concept to what the city's been doing for more than 20 years to make sure it has a secure supply of clean water. They've been investing in acquiring land and conservation easements surrounding New York City's reservoirs in Westchester and in the Catskills. So they did that because there was a legal threat and they would have had to spend billions of dollars to build a filtration plant. And they've been incredibly successful in this effort, and a lot of those projects have been conserving farms in the watershed. Now it's time to do it in the context of access to food, and the city can be a leader, a national leader, and the city also won't be alone because the federal program, the state program, and the local programs already exist. So very quickly, before I move on, I want to touch on a couple of emerging issues that relate. One is affordability. Just conserving a farm, saying it can't be subdivided, doesn't mean it's going to stay in production, and it doesn't mean the next young farmer or new farmer is going to be able to afford it. So we've been working with the state and our partner Land Trust to put into place tools that will ensure the land will not just be set aside from development, but make sure it doesn't become an estate farm or a hobby farm, and instead is affordable. Second, climate, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And third is food sovereignty. We're taking steps, and we all need to take more steps to ensure that people have greater control over the sources of their food, and that people who've been disenfranchised from owning farms have opportunities that they haven't had in the past. Very quickly, and I know I'm running out of time, with respect to climate, what does that piece mean in a region like ours? New York State, and it says New York City, but New York State last year passed a law that created a carbon farming pilot study. And at 10 farms in the Hudson Valley, studies are about to begin to quantify the benefits of climate resilient farming practices so that those can be turned into effective public policy, either through carbon pricing, incentives, grants, or new tax policy. Cornell is also engaging in similar research. What's really critical here from the city's perspective is the way that we talk about this. And I know that Anthony's going to get into this topic some. And when we talk about things like agroecology, when we use words like carbon farming, if you talk to your traditional, conventional farmer in a rural area, they're going to zone out. If you talk about the economic benefits, productivity benefits, phrases like soil health and viability, they're going to listen and they're going to engage. And they're already doing some of these practices, but they cannot afford to make the transition just with what they have now. They're all struggling financially. So what our hope is that through a program of conservation easement purchases to secure the farms, we will also be able to add incentives to help them transition over a period of 3 to 5 years to more carbon-friendly farming practices. Thank you.
Hey, glad to be here with you all. Great crowd. My name's Anthony Flacameno. I'm from a little town in southwestern Virginia, Abingdon. I have a small farm and do economic development work there. Am I going the wrong way?
Just two more.
No, that's the wrong way. There I am. Cool. Okay. Great. So thank you all again for being here. I'm going to talk about this issue from a rural perspective, from a farmer, but also more broadly a rural perspective. I live in an area that was once kind of populist and democratic and now is deeply red, as we like to say. But I'm going to start with a bit of context, kind of put it into more of an economic context to begin, just real quickly. This graph right here, you see those two bars, they show the change in the population of the United States from 1980, when we had about 230 million people, to roughly the present, 2016, when we had 320 million people. 1980 was the year Ronald Reagan was elected to his first term. During that exact same all right, now check those out again. That's how much we grew population-wise, about 42, 43%. Our economy, adjusted down for inflation, grew almost threefold. And what that means is that during that period of time, when you say the economy is 3 times bigger, that means 3 times more goods and services being produced and sold, 3 times more money moving through the economy. So the biggest question in all of this from an economic point of view is, where did that all go? If the population grew this much, the economy grew this much, why aren't most of us much better off? Okay, so that's the broader framework. And we know the basic answer to that is because almost all of that went to the top of the top, right? But it's also the fact that we are agriculture, and the entire question of a Green New Deal is saddled with a bipartisan commitment to an endless growth economy. That's what we got. And endless growth doesn't work well for people, it doesn't build wealth, and it sure doesn't work for the ecosystem. So within this larger economy based on growth at all costs, continuous growth, endless growth, is our food and farming system. And it's essentially a subset of that, a microcosm of it. And it's based on a model of extraction. You extract from the health of animals by putting hogs and chickens and beef cattle in tiny cages and getting the most out of them in the least amount of time. You extract from farm workers like Lucas Benitez, that I had the privilege to meet a few years ago, led the Immokalee Farm Workers Coalition, because farm workers in Florida were getting paid a penny a pound to pick tomatoes. That means if you pick 2 tons of tomatoes a day, you get $40. But not just the farm workers, but farmers, like my buddy Martin Miles from Lee County, Virginia, who were also caught in this extractive, low-pay system. And a big piece of that, like the broader economy, again, is the fact that so much of the agricultural system and the rural development system has been concentrated, that we have essentially decided to give a pass to corporate mergers and monopolization over the last 30 plus years, and as a result, groups like Tyson and a few others essentially call all the shots. What are the results of that? Well, from an ecological point of view, the soil, which when we talk about how to talk with farmers understand soil. They may not talk regenerative agriculture, but they do talk soil. Well, the soil, rather than being a sink, it becomes a source. It's a source of pollution downstream. It's a source of nitrogen and phosphorus in the Gulf of Mexico and everything in between. And it's a source of carbon, right? It's contributing. So all of us environmentalists talk about how agriculture is part of the problem. That's because farmers are forced into this kind of low-wage system. And it isn't just farmland. A lot of the East Coast, certainly the Appalachians, but even up into New York State, really it's more forest than farms. It's a mix of the two. In the rural areas, we've gotten into this model where basically we overuse our ecological capital, like when we clear-cut Appalachian hardwood forests, but at the same time we undervalue them. So we get maximum ecological damage and minimum economic benefit because we ship the products out of the area with almost no value added, so the local community gets the bad and not the good. And so as a result of those things and a lot of other things, Fox News and Breitbart and all that crap, as a result of it, we have gotten to the point where rural people generally, especially coal miners, and I'm from a coal mining region, but also farmers, believe me, they hate environmentalists. They hate the EPA. They think you're their enemy. A lot of them. Not the little hippie farmers like me, but a lot of regular old farmers. That's what they think. They think that regulations are not working. They're just trying to control them. It's the nanny state and all of that narrative. And then fundamentally, as we move into this, we have to understand that just more information is not going to persuade rural people and farmers and a lot of working folks generally. We have to understand that in rural communities, livelihood is the way people think about the environment. Many folks, the environmental movement has a lot of great people in it, but primarily it's driven by urban and suburban people. And the experience of the environment, the ecosystem, is primarily one we go into to be regenerated. We go in there to hike and to camp and to recreate and get spiritually recharged. But in rural areas, that's not what the environment's for. It's how you make a living, right? It's getting old logs like we do and sawing them up for wood heat. It's raising a little bit of food. It's fishing. It's hunting. It's all of that. So it's led to what Catherine Kramer in her book calls a politics of resentment. And again, I totally recognize that much of that has been stoked and cultivated by a tremendously well-funded false narrative on the right. No doubt about that. But it's also true that people have legitimate frustrations, and this resentment has then come to focus on what they consider to be elites. And again, that's kind of us, or you. But that's only one part of the picture. That's only one part, because the work that I've been fortunate to do, and lots of other people all over the country, rural and urban, and I've worked in urban areas as well, but mostly in rural, shows that something else is possible. This guy right here is one of my best buddies in the world, John Mullins. He was one of the first tobacco farmers to join our effort to create what was the first food hub in the Appalachian region, where you aggregate produce. And John, born and raised in Lee County, Virginia, tobacco farmer his whole life, here he is, he's in front of some of our boxes at our packing house, proudly holding 3 tomatoes. He was raising 10, 12 acres of tomatoes while smoking a cigarette. And so this image is kind of like, this is who we need to reach. If we really want to penetrate that universe, we got to figure out ways that a guy like John will see us as an ally and not as an enemy. When we do that, we begin to reach all kinds of farmers. And we know that another issue in this whole question of the Green New Deal is, what's the role of animal agriculture? And I hope we get to talk about that in Q&A. But it sure isn't as simple as meat is bad. It's all about how the landscape is managed. And when you manage it like Paul Rizzo is doing here, or you manage it with multi-species that keeps your weeds down and creates multiple streams of nutrients and builds the soil health simultaneous, you're sequestering carbon, you're pulling it out of the atmosphere where we've got too much, and you're putting it in the soil, and you got healthier meat and healthier milk and healthier eggs when you get them from animals like that. Folks like me who raise fruits and vegetables on my little farm, a lot of it comes down to, how do we keep something growing on the landscape at all times? How do you keep the soil covered? Rodale did a 13-year study on a low-till organic rotation for grain production, and they found that they were pulling enough carbon that if we transitioned all of U.S. Farmland, cropland, we'd do the equivalent of taking 158 million cars off the road. This is another picture from my little farm. This is an organic no-till, where you're raising a cover crop, you're killing it in place, not with an herbicide, and then planting directly into it, in this case, broccoli plants. And we're seeing it all over, and come into I was really glad to follow Steve, because it's also a question very much of land ownership. So land is relatively cheap where I am in Southwest Virginia, although the prices are rising steadily. But really, it is a question of who is owning the land. That's partly a question just keeping it in farming fundamentally, and it's also a question of who gets it. I'm sure you all are very cognizant of the phenomenal loss of black-owned farmland in this country over the last century, somewhere between 85 and 90% of all. So people like Dennis Derrick with Corbin Hill Food Project, people like Shirley Sherrod, specifically trying to reclaim some of that farmland is absolutely critical. The other thing is the ownership structure of the farm enterprises. So most of the farmers I work with are small independent farmers, but there is a slight emergence of producer cooperatives, like New South Co-op in western Arkansas that I got to work with a few years ago, mostly young farmers, very encouraging. A couple more slides and I'm done. The other thing we got to remember too is that the part of how we get beyond this resentment is that farmers and foresters and fishermen, they feel like what they hear from the environmental movement all the time is, don't do what you're doing, or we're going to stop you, we're going to keep you from doing the bad stuff that you do that ruins the environment. And not only is it true that you can transition tobacco farmers and other less sustainable farmers, but also in forest practices. We had a business for quite a few years in which we were managing forests sustainably, like truly sustainably. The image on the left, Jennifer and Sherry Wagner, that's their forest land in Washington County, Virginia, after we had completed a timber harvest job. And we took the logs from their property and others, we sawed them locally, we kiln dried them, we made them into hardwood flooring and sold them as a sustainable brand. It's one of many examples of where we think of our forests, our fisheries, and our farmlands having potential as being working landscapes. They're contributing their most fundamental ecological value, but they're also making products for us. If we move in this direction, here's the deal. Right now we have, by estimates, it's hard exactly to know, about 850 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. 850 gigatons. A gigaton, I think, is 1 billion metric tons, I believe is what it is. That's a lot of carbon, right? But we have, at the same time, 3 times that much carbon in our soils worldwide. 3 times. And here's the trick. Over the last 60, 70 years, maybe a couple hundred years, depending on how you look at it, we've given up half or more of our soil carbon. So that 2,700 gigatons we have now is less than half of what it was historically before we started tearing up the Great Plains and opening up the farmland of Argentina and Brazil. We have tremendous potential and an urgent need to use these working landscapes of pasture land, of croplands, and of forests as sinks. We need to return them to that value, and it's going to take money. It's going to take private money like you get through slow money. It's going to take public investment, and it's going to take investment not only in helping farmers get to the right practices, because as Steve said, it's expensive to make these transitions, to do it the right way, but we got to invest in the food system infrastructure that allows farmers to get a better price, because one of the reasons why farmland is sold off is because it's not profitable to farm for most people. So unless we can make farming really profitable, a decent living for the farmers and the farm workers, then it's always going to be this tremendous pull of development to take it out of farmland. I'll say briefly, I recently joined Farmers and Ranchers for a Green New Deal. It's a brand new initiative, but I'll just say in passing that I think it's going in the right direction, because Farmers and Ranchers for a Green New Deal is trying to pull in not just the sort of mini farmers on the outskirts of big cities, but traditional farmers and ranchers as well. It's a good vehicle. So that's it. Thanks.
Come on up. What a wonderful discussion. It's still stretching a bit, trying to understand it all. What? Does this work? Good. So I was saying, a really wonderful discussion, and we're going to just talk loud. And we want to take a little bit of time to talk among ourselves. I'm going to ask 2 questions that really came up from listening to what you each had to say, and then we're going to open it up for questions and comments from all of you. So one of the things that struck me in listening to each of your talks was the question of scale. And I think we're, on the one hand, we heard about wonderful innovation at each of the levels that the speakers talked about. And on the other hand, we know the problem that we're confronting will require us to move to a different scale pretty quickly in order to have an impact. And so I think what I'd like to ask each of you, and maybe in the order you spoke, to talk a little about, and I'm going to try and focus you on one issue because I'm hoping we can keep this discussion moving quickly. What would it take to get to another scale in the next 5 to 10 years? What are the opportunities for going to scale? And then what are some of the challenges? And just a few thoughts that will maybe open up that discussion. And Erin, I hope that you could talk about that in relation to procurement. Jen, around youth workforce development, what would it take to get to scale? What would it take to be doing this not in 5 or 6 NYCHA facilities, but in 30 or 50? Steve, what would it take over the next several years to have the beginnings of an integrated regional food system? And Anthony, what would it take to really change the sustainable farming practices, say, on the East Coast over the next 5 to 10 years to actually have an impact? So some of your first thoughts on that. Erin, you want to start?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll share three things that I think are critical for that around the element of procurement that we talked about from a city perspective. The first is about really bringing our resources together as a city and a city government. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of really good thinking and work done in a number of agencies that are engaged in this effort. And increasingly, I think that there's an opportunity, not just in a framework, but in collective thinking about purchasing, decisions, et cetera, to really bring those choices together in a way that people are working collectively. The second thing I would say is around, the one thing that struck me is about, we're all talking about communication to different audiences. And I think the more that this is not important conversations that are happening with different language in different groups, but how are we building a narrative that connects these dots in a way that people are not just aware, but they're understanding what they can do to contribute to that from their perspective, from a public sector, from a community engaged in that work, from producers and growers. And I think we have some work to be able to really bring that together. And the third is really about this relationship too. I think, I was acknowledging as a purchaser of these resources, we also heard about the growers. And I think that we need to do more to think about what are the ways that we're signaling and incenting being able to make those values of purchasing local not just something that we think are important, but that we're actually able to act on.
Great, thanks. And in the other folks' comments, if you can do what Erin did, which is, as you think about scale, what are ways of linking sustainability and food that will help to get to scale?
There's 325 NYCHA developments across the city, and it's like 500,000 residents who depend in housing, like I mentioned. And what I believe we need for scale is what I mentioned, which is like this EcoHub model of making sure that first of all we have the funds, that there's city investment, and and belief that this is the way forward. That NYCHA, we need land in NYCHA. There's 325 developments, but there isn't enough land to go around that NYCHA would consider as a viable space for the production of the site. But I also mentioned the EcoHub model, which is the efficiencies in these spaces, because in order for like the farm land to be a viable, long-term, sustainable solution, it needs to have real, just like innovative like systems, and for it to keep on going, and for the core. And what we believe is that, we need enough people to know about the work. There isn't enough folks in the city. I mean, I think there's enough folks in the city where we need to just come together and have a coalition. I mean, we do. I just think that there needs to be a unified movement of folks wanting for it to happen at NYCHA to this degree, but also just understanding that NYCHA may not have the spaces available. And so just thinking about how we can replicate this model and scale, but have efficiencies, systems tied to it, so there isn't issues on water, there isn't like other just consequences of having farm spaces in the city, and for it to just keep on going. But I think it's a unified front, and for NYCHA, just really just learning about how much space is really available for it to continue, and for us to think about what's an efficient, best way for us to do this, so it's not compromising on other sustainable parts of farming, which is what we know the biggest criticism is the water consumption and all those things. So I think that's, for us, that's it. Like, city investment is also really neat. We need city and state investment, and just continued strategic partnerships across the city so we can scale up.
Thanks.
So there are more than 5,000 farms in the Hudson Valley region serving New York City, and fewer than 15% of them are conserved. Back in 2016, after the Foodshed Conservation Plan was put in place, Governor Cuomo put $20 million in the state budget as sort of a down payment to kick off the implementation of that. What we need going forward is a new partnership between the federal government, which has a program through the Farm Bill, New York State, which has its ongoing program, but doesn't perhaps have the energy that a new partnership would bring. New York City, finally, at the table as an investor and stakeholder sharing those costs, and the partnership then with the land conservation community and the agricultural community. If those resources were combined, and if the programs were aligned to the extent possible in a sort of a shared policy framework. We know we're never going to have exactly the same guidelines from the federal government, the state, the city, and local governments, but find as much common ground as possible. Unlike other dimensions of the climate issue, it's not like we need some new technology that hasn't been invented yet. We have all the players, we have the mechanism for doing it. What we don't have is policy direction, partnership, and financial resources.
So we need a Green New Deal, for one, to have a national consensus that this is critical and we're going to invest in a different way of raising food as well as an energy system. We got to do other things that are either going to be part of that or accompany it. Right now, just a few days ago, the Trump administration reduced the number of inspectors for hog production, hog processing facilities, and simultaneously allowed those producers to increase the line speed where the hogs are killed and butchered. Trump sucks, but the Obama administration tried to do something very similar with the poultry industry. So again, we have a bipartisan consensus to have a cheap food extractive agricultural system, and we have to change that. Part of that is fighting concentration. Right now, chicken producers in Arkansas and Oklahoma and elsewhere are getting paid between 4 and 5 cents per pound for the chickens they produce. And that's on top of taking on basically all of the liability of production. The price is controlled, their input costs are controlled. What they get is the debt for building these facilities, and 4 to 5 cents per pound. If we continue to allow concentration in every aspect of our economy, but specifically farming and the food system, we will never get to this, because the small to mid-sized sustainable producer, whether they're raising animals, grain, or vegetables, will always be at a severe disadvantage, and their products will always be dramatically more expensive if we don't tackle monopolization. The other thing I'll say is part of tackling that is not just fighting the bad stuff, it's investing in food system infrastructure. So we need that, whether it's farmers markets, whether it's food hubs that are connecting Hudson Valley to New York City, whatever it is, we need a lot more than what we've got. It's been encouraging that that's been happening over the last little bit. And lastly, we need direct payments to farmers for ecosystem services. We've had similar things to help farmers protect the riparian zones and et cetera, so it's not a new concept, it's just specifically paying farmers and forest managers and fishermen for the best practices that are going to pull carbon out of the atmosphere.
Great, thanks. Second and last question from me. I think in your presentations, you all pointed out some of the ways that our food systems and our energy systems are inequitable, that the costs and benefits of those systems are unfairly imposed on some populations, particularly low-income, Black, Latino, recent immigrant populations, and unfairly accrue to other populations. And I'm asking you, again, maybe sticking to the sectors that you were just talking about, what is one policy change you could recommend that would help to reduce some of those inequities? And if you can particularly think about the energy-food intersection, where a policy change might help to reduce those. And maybe we'll just ask you to start, Steve, and travel down the line.
So this is the toughest one, I think, because of the long sort of legacy of past practices that has led to where we are now. And we now have the emergence of some new organizations, for example, the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, that is going out of its way to identify people who are interested in engaging in agriculture and having a stake in the land. We have certain legal models, like the community land trust models that's been used in urban environments, that can now be used, is being sort of experimented with in more rural environments. The land conservation easements that I was talking about help to make the land more affordable. Basically what it does is it takes, if the way it works is you have a piece of land that's worth, say, $10, you put this easement on that strips away the development rights, it's now worth $4 or $5. That means someone coming in can now buy that farm, not for 10, but for the difference, $5 or $6. It makes it more affordable, and it makes it easier for people who've been disenfranchised from the land to have the opportunity to acquire it and hold it. But it's going to be a challenging and long-term effort, and the first thing we have to do is acknowledge it, and we have to then put some resources and public policy discussion behind educating the public about it.
I would say from a perspective of an urban environment where we see a lot of those inequities in New York and other places, I think two things are really critical. One, as we've acknowledged, having individuals or populations that are disadvantaged to a greater degree, essentially part of the solution making and essentially part of really thinking about how that's going to work for their communities. And I think that that's a real priority. The second piece to that is, from a policy perspective, where we're reinvesting in a lot of communities, making sure that this is, I think about it as kind of surround sound, right? If we really want to have conversation, we want to have resources that are reflective of these values, reflective of health and access, we need to make sure that people are not just aware and want to have those points of access, but that it is affordable for them, it is geographically accessible, that they see themselves as part of that that environment where that's important as a priority for them, because cost is equally on their side of that that wallet, a challenge to be able to buy that more expensive protein or vegetables, et cetera. But how do we make sure that it's not seen as only a public benefit, but a public right to be able to have those things, and providing resources to help make that happen?
It's tough to do one, but I won't do 9. I'll do somewhere between the two. No, I think that I'm going to say again, we've got to start enforcing antitrust. We've got to, the courts have weakened it. The administrations have looked the other way. That's critical. On the positive side, two things. One is, I think the goal of all our public policy at the local, state, and federal level should be building local wealth, meaning building local capacity. Some of that's physical wealth, land that you own, buildings, equipment, et cetera. Some of it is the skills and the knowledge and the social capital that you have. But local wealth building is really going to be the key to survival for the next few generations, because if we're not smart and have a lot of local capacity, we won't have resilient communities, and it won't matter how good a federal government we have. So I think that local wealth building. And then in terms of land, we have to convince particularly our local economic development agencies, but also at the state and federal level, that undeveloped land, meaning farmland, pasture land, and forest land, is actually most valuable in its ecological state, and that the key is not to develop it by putting buildings on it, but the key is to figure out how to actually make it valuable to that farmer or that land owner. That's really the critical. We have to shift the mindset from open space being seen as undeveloped, waiting for the mall or the development. That's fundamentally such a big part of our problem.
I would say universal service as a successful approach to workforce development, having a common experience and an inclusive way to just engage our young people of color to have a service and training exposure for a year would be an effective way for us to build the leaders that we need in the pipeline for the green jobs and to transform the city and this country.
Great, thanks. So we have about half an hour for discussion and questions. The format is we'll take 3 or 4 questions, one after the other, and then ask the panelists to comment on those questions that speak to them. Not everybody has to respond to every question. And we also would welcome questions on this 7-point plan that I mentioned before and that's available on the table. And if you have suggestions for additions or comments or questions about it, feel free to add those. So we'll take 3 in the back row there to get started.
I'm so excited about these things that are happening, and but I'm a little bit concerned. Partnerships and the policies are in place. You can hear me, right? I'm just concerned that until all the supports and the partnerships and policies are in place. I'm Barbara Caparelli, hi. Form school graduate. Anyway, and community gardener, and shifting the paradigm of community gardens to be looked at as a place where we can meet community food need. We have kids' food justice program. Anyway, I'm just concerned that until all these supports are in place, new farmers in particular, but all farmers, are looking for other ways to make money and always looking at value-added products. I see some shift into CBD oil. I'm getting concerned about marijuana and the legalization of it and the potential taking away this land that we really want to increase for food for our region. That's all. Are you concerned about that?
Two more questions, and then we'll...
Want me to go?
Hi, I can't write, so I'm using one of these pads. Introduce yourself, please. Food project. That you equate me with Sherrod is kind of like an honor that I don't deserve. For most of you who don't know, she will be celebrating her 50th, the 50th year coming up in terms of a land trust for black folks out of Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, and she was part of the settlement of the Pickfoot settlement that received $16 million for what they had done in terms of destroying what would have been new communities, an incredible model. Tony, I must also compliment you, the only person on the stage who has explicitly utilized the word wealth. Wealthy communities are healthy communities, and healthy communities are wealthy communities. But we're consistently being defined as a community of black folks, Latinos, and the marginalized as consumers. And so none of the work that we hear here, other than the fact, of course, Steve, we've been talking for 10 years now about the land trust issue, but even those land trusts that have been in the state of New York, none of them have been owned by a single person, black or Latinx. Okay? So let's understand it. Of the 55,000 farmers we have in New York State, the census, the 2017 census, identified only 167 being black and Latino farmers. When we talk about a procurement process that has essentially 10 agencies, you use the $300 million figure, but the figure I got from CUNY, and I believe Craig, when he sends me those data, is the fact that it's close to $750 million a year, and next 2 or 3 years will be $1 billion a year. And not a single piece of that legislation addresses the issue of where will that $750 million go in terms of community building and community wealth building in the black community with 117 farmers. So thank goodness at least there's some beginning link between what's going on upstate and downstate. And to the question that I would like to understand is, do you think you have a moral responsibility that when you talk about these issues to bring race into it, not just race in general, but black people?
One or two more, and then we'll...
Okay, over here.
Respond.
Over here on this side. Stephen O'Brien, Office of Food and Nutrition Services. I'd just like to, first of all, thank you to all the panelists. I think this was a very thought-provoking conversation and looking forward to keeping it going. I'd like to broaden the conversation a little bit and think about how does your work support increasing food consumption and decreasing food waste at the farm, the market, and during service?
Hello. Hi, I'm Ntebo Mokoena. I'm here in my capacity as a digital campaigner at Daily Kos. So the Green New Deal is kind of like an octopus, it has several arms and they need to work in complement with each other. Specifically for the folks who are in the public sector on the panel, before I get to my question, thank you all for being here and sharing your knowledge with us. My question is about your criteria for choosing private partnerships. I looked on the website specifically for your organization, and I noticed that there's some pipeline banks and banks that have, had to settle out of court for predatory lending practices. How do you choose your partners? Because to me, it seems contradictory to have organizations working kind of against the other parts of the Green New Deal while trying to work on food justice and also just housing justice for people who are already more likely to be preyed upon in predatory lending practices. Thanks.
We'll take some time to answer those, and then we'll have another round of questions. And maybe we'll start you, Finn, on the far end, if you have thoughts. And just say a little bit about which of the questions you're responding to.
Okay, I need a mic.
I think, I'm sorry, can you, the office, yeah, what's it, Brett? Stephen O'Brien, so that, were you, so the reduction of, can you repeat your question?
Sure. It was really about how do you think about increasing food consumption and reducing food waste throughout the whole food system, from the farms to the market to the service of the food.
So increasing food production and reducing food waste. So, I mean, just one of the things that I think of, so the work that we're doing, you know, we don't have a massive production we have an acre or two that we're working with, but we do have really significant approaches to waste management in our distribution practice. So we just recently started working with Department of Sanitation, but really are thinking about when we're harvesting and having our we have predictable numbers. And so we're thinking about how to increase every acre, every square footage of each of the beds for maximum production and yield. But we're also thinking about how our distribution approaches and our waste consumptions. And so we have 3-bin systems. We have all of the composting, systems that we need in order for us to bring it back to the soil and continue working that way. So it's a closed loop system. But I mean, that's just, we think about that all the time, and we have our community to support in culturally relevant production, and just always taking that into consideration. Do you guys have any?
Are we taking one question at a time?
Okay, one question at a time?
No,
Okay.
We don't need to have each person speak on each question, so let's go down.
And some of the others related to, was it specific to Green City Forest? I don't, so one of the, yeah, sure.
You know, some of these things will come up again, I'm sure.
Yeah, some of these I don't know that I'm that good to answer. A couple I'll try to take a crack at. One is the movement towards putting farmland in non-food production. Certainly, ethanol is a good horror story for us right now, and it was a foolish thing to do from an energy balance point of view, and it has certainly played right into the overproduction of corn. So whether or not CBD, which is this new phenomenon, and a lot of farmers in my part of the world and elsewhere are excited about the potential for growing hemp, I personally haven't done the numbers. I doubt that the acreage involved in producing enough hemp to meet the market demand would ever get anything close to what we've seen in fuel, ethanol, but I don't know that. So I think that's a good caveat. I think there's some gain, some value in raising hemp and marijuana, but I think that's a very good caveat. I'm going to focus a little more on Dennis's comment, and so let me just say two things. One is, again, I've sort of shifted over the last 40 years of this work to really making local wealth building to be along with the ecological things, the preeminent focus. I think when you start looking at how do you build real wealth, not Wall Street type wealth, but real enduring wealth, then you automatically get into questions of who owns land, who owns the productive equipment, who owns the capital. And if, for the most part, people of color, or for that matter, poor white Appalachians don't, then your economic development strategy has to be driven by how do you ensure that they own much more of that land base and the other capital. And we're not doing it right now. But it's in the consciousness, at least, of people in economic development and agriculture and food systems. So I think that is the key.
I'm going to respond to 2 points. I think going back to the point around how we connect as a system, and especially a public system, thinking about procurement all the way through reuse or disposal, that's really for broader public good and planetary good. There's a lot of work in the city around thinking about the different resources that we have, from as I talked about today, increasing more focus on environmentally or sustainably oriented food that we're very clearly prioritizing, increasingly bringing into what we know about as the food that we're buying and how we can provide that to different communities that we're serving through the next point of view of really making sure that we're donate, reusing, and really leveraging DEP, sanitation, other resources in the city that are actively working across agencies, across communities to not just donate for reuse, but also then take that food and incorporate it into very, technically oriented digesters at Hunt's Point, and thinking about redistribution to regional farms in Pennsylvania and New York for biosolids, and for actually organic material that is going back to support those farms that we're then intentionally then repurchasing from. So I mentioned before this frame around a circular economy. I think it's important not just to talk about that in the way that we have these resources, but truly bringing them together. Another point of view on that is also around design, and not in a broader perspective. I think there's a lot more work that we should be doing to make sure that when we as a city are buying food, that we're thinking about how that food's packaged, how it's coming into the city, how can we be thinking about responsible ways of getting it here? Because when an individual, a child, a senior sees it on their plate in the ways that they're receiving it, they're not seeing all the back end of materials or process and transportation. And so we need to be thinking about that much more consciously and how we're leveraging resources and working with the market to make sure that we're designing it in a way that's safe, but we're designing it in a way that's responsible. So that's one piece. I want to acknowledge the point around really making sure that we have an equitable table for many different producers and farmers and people of different communities that are doing this work. And I think one of the important pieces is not just to see the food you're eating as something that you're consuming for your benefit, but understanding the story of that food. And if we're not investing upstream in who the people are that are growing that food from very different backgrounds, race, ethnicity, wealth, then we can be mindful of it, but we're not helping make alternative choices. And so I think bringing that data point of view in, not just for knowledge, but helping to then change that perspective is really important.
I'd like to address two of the questions. One was the hemp question, and the other was Derek's question about moral responsibility. And I think the hemp question is another symptom of what I'll call not food insecurity, but farmer insecurity. And farmers are more likely to sort of chase the bright new shiny thing if it is likely to generate a return to them that will allow them to handle all of the costs of production, the tax burden that they have, and the other competing demands on their lives. And if, as Anthony said before, food production can generate wealth for farmers, it will also then, I think, generate food security as well as farmer security. I think, anyone who's working in the space of the relationship between people and land have a responsibility to, one, acknowledge, and two, begin to take steps to address the historical injustices. One of the things our land trust did was worked with Karen Washington, whom many of you know, and a group of women farmers to help them find a farm in Orange County where they now have the Rise and Root Farm, and is now a base for them to be able to communicate more broadly about those interests and to become successful in their own right. They're now looking, I believe, for perhaps a second farm location. Also, people like Leah Pennington, who at the Soul Fire Farm and has become such an eloquent and powerful speaker on this issue so broadly. I think we also have to think about the relationship between people and the land and race beyond just agriculture, so that people understand those historical connections. We just partnered with a local land trust in the city of Kingston and an organization, Harambe, to conserve a historic African burial ground in a residential neighborhood behind a street, behind a house that nobody knew was there. And that is bringing a sense of caring and human relationship to the land and an understanding of these historical injustices that I think will help to catalyze more activity.
I wanted to comment on the question around public-private partnerships. Thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a really important question. And in my view, that some of the impetus for nonprofit organizations and public organizations to form partnerships with corporations comes from a faith-based belief rather than an evidence-based belief that the only way to solve the world's social problems today are to partner with corporations. And I think the goal isn't moral purity or political correctness. The goal is impact and credibility of our organizations that are trying to bring about food and nutrition and environmental goals. And I think when our organizations make alliances with organizations that are damaging our community or misrepresenting science, we damage our own credibility, and we make more difficult the partnerships, the equally, or in my view, more important partnerships with mass organizations, with people organizations, with organizations representing those who are bearing the brunt of the inequities. I think it's particularly complicated in the areas that we're talking about today, because many of the corporations that seek to form partnerships with nonprofits and public agencies work in a lot of arenas, and they might make commitments around environmental protection. Some of the big food companies have done that, and some of their commitments are worth considering, but at the same time, they're producing and selling and marketing relentlessly the products that are making our kids sick and that are driving the health inequalities that characterize this city and the world. And I think we just need to take a step back and say, what will we gain from this partnership, and what will they gain, and what will we lose, and what will they lose? And when we make that sober analysis, I think some of the partnerships that we're engaged in now might fall by the wayside. Another round of questions.
Nick, can I add one thing just very quickly to that, which is that also getting into the weeds of specifically what are the alternatives. When we started the food hub that I started, there was this great temptation to sell to Walmart. And I thought, why would we sell to Walmart when they've been part of undermining the very system? What we did was we looked at, well, what are our alternatives? Because we were looking at selling to grocery stores. And we found out that 60% of groceries, even though Walmart was huge, were still going through locally owned mom and pop to medium-sized chains. That's true throughout all of the elements of the food system. So if you dig a little deeper, you can usually find something that's a little more local, a little more community-based to partner with. And you don't have to go to U.S. Foods and Walmart.
So let's take two questions on this side and the back, maybe the two of you standing up, and then two on this side, and then another round.
Should I go ahead since I'm over here and have the mic? Or I'll let Eric go first. Go, Eric.
My name is Eric Weltman. I'm a Brooklyn-based organizer with Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Action. First of all, I want to acknowledge Scenic Hudson as being a tremendously forward-thinking ally, including partnering with efforts to oppose a frack gas power plant in the Hudson Valley. You've been a tremendous ally in that effort. I also want to sort of highlight the role of corporations in dictating not only what's produced, but how it's produced and by whom. I think on that note that one of the greatest triumphs that we had here in New York is keeping Walmart out of New York City. There are no Walmarts in New York City. I think that's a tremendous, boon to, our food, economy. I want to talk a little bit about, policies, state-level policies that could, advance these efforts. I'd love to hear your feedback on this. In two states, Iowa and Oregon, we're actually trying to ban factory farms. And there are other initiatives. For example, in New York, we're going to be supporting legislation that would ban the misuse of antibiotics on factory farms, which is in and of itself a public health crisis. So I'd just love to hear more discussion about state-level policies, municipal-level policies that could really undermine corporate control and abuse of our food system.
Thank you. The person standing next to you, and then we'll move over to the other side.
Hi, thank you. Is this on? Hi, thank you so much. This is great. My name is Caroline Wimberly. I work for an organization called 50 by 40 and also the Food and Climate Alliance. And I work on international policy. But I just wanted to know, Anthony's probably the best one on this, but or the most relevant person, excuse me. But welcome all your thoughts.
I'm the best.
Well, I'm trying to win brownie points. Yeah, so I would love to get anyone's thoughts on how to better and more effectively link the meat dairy reduction efforts with kind of the pasture-based, grass-fed community, because I think there's this, they go together in a sense, but there's a fallacy that if we just switch to pasture-based systems, everything will be fine, and we cannot feed the world with the demand for meat and dairy with pasture-based systems. We don't have enough land. We don't even have enough land, let alone agricultural land. So those arguments to me have to be linked, and they're really never are. So would love your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, everybody. My name is Todd Fernandez. I'm working on legislative and movement building strategy, volunteering my time with 350 NYC. We have two initiatives underway. One's the People's Green New Deal. We're collecting environmental policy proposals from the entire spectrum of the movement, from energy to food to plastics, you name it. So we already have 90 collected, and we're asking for more of those. And we're going to put them all in a report where they'll be itemized specifically by category, and organizations and individuals will be able to vote for the ideas that they like. We're trying to see where the consensus is across the spectrum of greenhouse gas sources and solutions, so we can unite for critical political mass. So on that point, in November, we're going to be hosting a series of conversations about how we build a national network, a climate coalition network, so that we can work across sectors collectively to pass this legislation in 2021. So my questions are, for the panelists, if you could please speak to the system of networks right now that you're involved in, and what's missing in terms of our communication and coordination for collective political power at the national level. On a more specific level, how this issue of single-use plastics fits into the agricultural arena as we seek to ban those, how that's going to play out. And then the idea of co-locating renewable energy facilities and how that could work into your land trust idea, so that we can solve two problems at once. You know, the solar and renewable energy people are having trouble siting facilities, getting approval for them, not in my backyard. So I think there are synergies that we will see between the food and ag and energy movements once we see what the demands are and how we can all work together to make them happen. Thank you.
One more question on that side, and make it short if you can, please.
Yes. Hi, my name is David Cantor. I'm an assistant professor of environmental studies at NYU. My research is on nutrient pollution, and thank you for organizing this panel today. Two quick questions. One, on the procurement side of things, I noticed in the 7-point plan there was a lot about increasing the sustainability of procurement practices. I didn't see as much in the New York City plan, but maybe it's just because we didn't have time to cover that. Initiatives on using the financial power of New York City's procurement to ensure sustainability practices downstream. And then from a kind of farm and policy perspective, most government programs to try and improve the sustainability on farms have not been particularly effective when you actually look at environmental outcomes. Specifically from, say, a nutrient perspective, you look at the size of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and whether there are more innovative policy approaches. So, for example, imposing standards on wastewater treatment plants to make sure that more wastewater is able to be reused as a nutrient, or sustainable supply chain codes for multinational corporations. Those kind of initiatives that could be more useful. I'd be really interested in some insights there as well.
We're running out of time. This will be our closing set of answers. I hope that those of you who still have questions might be able to chat with the speakers for a few minutes after the session. And I'm going to ask the panelists to answer no more than 2 of the many questions we heard. And Jen, if you're willing to start again.
Yeah, I think some of the things that I think about when it comes to the networks that we're building. So one of our national component to when we say national, we're based in New York City, is our AmeriCorps just connection. So AmeriCorps is a national organization, and we work with specifically the Core Network in our service core movement. And so the Corporation of Community Service is working really closely to just work on all the policy changes in regards to like the work that needs to happen for core movement, workforce development, and an inclusive, just like an inclusive understanding of all that. So we need to, so that's the AmeriCorps connection, and what we're doing is building a real strong partnerships with the city and NYCHA, but really local partners in understanding how we're working together to get all of the just innovative training platforms, like everything that we need in regard to like future innovative just opportunities that are happening in the sustainable sector, and working closely to have the leaders that have support for the leaders that we're training and developing. So it's still in development, and there's a lot more work to do in regards to our broader network, and we hope to build a coalition. We're the first and only actually accredited core network, a AmeriCorps organization in New York State. So we're hoping to just build a platform, a movement, and scale the youth part with the work that we're doing with the sustainability priorities in New York City.
I'll try to, one, in terms of what's missing, who's missing from the networks that are formulating policy, I'd say generally it's working folks and low-income people. We kind of, among our many divides in our country at this point, we have kind of a thinker-doer divide that I experience all the time. And those of us that are working in the field, whether we're farmers or entrepreneurs or community activists, are kind of much revered, but rarely invited to actually be part of the big discussion. So it's the academics, the intellectuals, and the policy wonks who formulate the frameworks, and then those of us in the field who kind of are asked to carry them out or implement them. Let's get over that. Let's recognize that people working on the ground in whatever actually have a lot of wisdom to contribute to the big picture stuff. So I think that's the big piece missing. In terms of your question, so I think the jury's out on what the actual productive potential is for grass-based systems. When you do some of what Joel Salatin's doing with stacking enterprises, when you have multiple species following on the same land, which doesn't work on some landscapes, but certainly does on many, it's roughly competitive with the corn and soybean-based system, at least for some landscapes, in my belief. I do think that there probably is a gap there, but I think if we're thinking of the global protein needs, it's certainly ironic that on the one hand, we're trying to get so many people to eat less meat and drink less milk, and simultaneously we're not willing to pay a little bit more. Maybe if we were paying 25 or 30%, recognizing that not everybody can do that and there has to be an increase in wages, there might be a little closer to compatibility between spending a little bit more per ounce of protein on the one hand and cultivating a regenerative system on the others. But it's an open question.
I'm going to answer first to the procurement question, since that was directed to the thinking we're doing. Yes. So the work in New York City and other places that use good food purchasing and other frameworks that we're thinking about, because this is a buildable effect into the work we're already doing, does incorporate that. I think one of the things that's important, and we're always acknowledging here, choices and what are the driving, what's the principle that we're driving from. And this conversation is about how we bring sustainability and social good into that conversation and our choices. Equally, from the perspective of why we're procuring, is about having enough food to provide two key populations that we're serving, in this case in New York City. And so part of that dynamic around not just incorporating values of sustainability into the ways that we're procuring is also recognizing what choices we have. We have to put food on those tables for the individuals we're serving on a daily basis. We need to make sure that that food is of high quality. We have to make sure that we have resources to be able to buy that food. And then we then need to make sure that we're thinking about all of these other dynamics of where that food is coming from, having the right information about that food, having the right amount of food from the market. So all of those things are fitting into this decision process, right? And so absolutely it's part of it, but it's part of building how we think about reconciling all those different pieces to, as a public system, ultimately provide public good that we're serving to individuals that we need to make sure have resources that are healthy, and that we want to make sure we're doing that in a sustainable way. And that, I think, is part of the decision process that we're going through.
So I'm so glad the question was asked about renewable energy, solar in particular, and farms. And a few years ago, I think we experienced, the agricultural community experienced sort of, I'll call it predatory solar. Solar developers who were speculators, much in the way that the sort of advanced guys for fracking companies were out there talking to farmers, were blanketing the agricultural community with sort of bad deals for them to turn over their farmland to solar because they knew that these farmers were in economic hard straits. We have seen a transition from that where the solar development community has become much more sophisticated and much more sensitive to the issues. And you're absolutely right, local communities, you'll ask people around a table to raise your hand if they're concerned about climate and we need to do something about it. They'll say yes, propose a solar project in their backyard, and they'll do everything in their power to fight it. So there's a real sweet spot here because farmers need the additional revenue. And if we can work with the solar community and farmers to right size and right design the solar projects, they will get that revenue, it will help their farms to be more viable, and we'll have more renewable energy, which we need so badly. Secondly, I wanted to address the question about nutrient pollution and other environmental quality impacts of agriculture. I think questions of geography and scale are incredibly important. We can't think about places like the Hudson Valley, for example, being like the Great Midwest and the major factory farms. It's not what we're talking about. At the same time, we don't really have great data on what are the environmental impacts of local agriculture in our region. And so we're working with a group of service providers and the Cary Institute for Ecosystem Studies and others to try to get a handle on that. We just held a meeting with a group of stakeholders a couple of weeks ago, and nutrient management, soil health, and water quality were the top three issues that they're trying to address. And the last thing I'll say is that New York City has actually been an absolute pioneer in this area and has been tremendously successful through the Watershed Agricultural Council that is working with farmers in the Catskill watershed and has worked with them to fund and implement very effectively best management practices that are making sure that you guys have clean water to drink every day.
So some thank yous. First to Maggie Dickinson and Rosita Ilyava, who really organized both the thinking and the panel today. So thanks to both of you. To our panelists who gave us a depth and wealth of thoughts, and most of all to you all for your questions, your critical questions, and your expanding the discussion. I wanted to end by again asking you to look at this Putting Food on the Green New Deal menu, 7-point plan. Here at the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute, we're spending our thinking and efforts and resources to thinking about how to move this forward over the next 3 years. And we would really welcome your thoughts to the words on these papers, but also to the process of how you and your organization can use this or version 2.0 or 3.0 to move this discussion forward, to continue to be advancing policy changes that will help us to make improvements in our food system and our energy system and addressing climate change and greenhouse gases. Thank you all very much for coming, and hope to see you next month.